Sir, the House seems... Sir, the House seems to be in a very jolly mood.
Shekharji,
And
Shekharji.
therefore,
This is not the way.
may I request... Sir, will you bring the House to order?
All right. No, no. Oh, what is going on? No, Sanjay ji, ये नहीं. Sanjay ji, please.
Sir, since the House is in a very jolly mood, I think I'll start this on a very lighter note. You see, when a person who happens to be a Bengali is asked to speak on the finance bill, there is a presumption that he must be an economist. Now, I beg to say that I'm not an economist, but I would like to say that there is an inverse relationship. There is an inverse relationship between the number of economists produced and the condition of the economy of that state. I think, sir, yesterday, Mr. Elangovan, a very good friend of mine, a very erudite member from Tamil Nadu, he asked this very basic question: what sort of a budget is this? He was rather agitated. And then he said, this is not a budget for the 20th century. Now, it may be a Freudian slip on his part by saying 20th century. But I think he had a point. Yes, sir, this was not a budget for the 20th century. This was a budget for the 21st century. And the reason, perhaps, the Honorable Finance Minister shunned poetry, some of which her predecessors have been generously taking recourse to. She shunned generous rhetoric and came down to the point. She could have spun a web of dreams, like we've heard today. We've heard yesterday and today people saying that the tax to GDP ratio is too little. In other words, we must tax more. But if you tax more, you'll say the middle class is being squeezed. We are being told that perhaps the best index is the happiness index. In other words, those who are unhappy should be banished to some other part, which would leave a large section of this house vacant. We have been taking a situation whereby you want wealth creators to be in this country. But then you say that this is a society, this is a government which is only for the wealth creators, and then you say 20,000 of them have left the country. There has to be a degree of consistency in this whole narrative. A budget is just not a budget, just like economics is not a science. A budget takes into account political realities. A budget is made, a finance bill is done on the premise that what is possible and what is doable. There are certain political options which have got to be weighed. And these political options were very scrupulously weighed in this case. There was a conscious decision taken that the welfare net would be expanded. There was a very conscious decision taken that taxes will not rise. There was a very conscious decision taken that the health sector would be expanded. And these were flexible decisions given that we were faced with what can at best be called unprecedented, but it could also be compared to a war. No one expected the COVID situation, just like I guess no one really expected that the war in Ukraine would have such a devastating fallout over the rest of the world. But you must have that necessary flexibility to be able to do that. And I think one of the first things we must realize about this government's approach is that it is not molded by doctrine, it is molded by necessity. And it is molded by a degree of pragmatism which has come about. Now, there could be various alternatives. Now, many of the people here would say that everything must be done by the state. That is one approach to governance, where the state takes predominance over everything else. At least we have in the Modi government a far more practical approach whereby said the state is important, but society is far more important. And it is this blend to be able to match the state with society. And I think that is very important in governing this economics of this. Mr. Chidambaram spoke yesterday in his rather uncharacteristic emphasis on trivia on the private sector has been left out. Sir, the private sector is not left out, but the private sector normally, and with his rich experience should know, doesn't come under a union budget. It is governed by other facets. I think we must also realize that the povertarianism which my friend Manoj Jha articulated on the basis of a report, which my friend Mr. Amar Patnaik also alluded to, is not necessarily the only prescription we can have of this country going ahead. What is the basis on which this budget has been crafted? The budget has been crafted on the basis that society in India at this stage needs a blend of both entitlement, but more important, empowerment. You can have two approaches to a sick person. You can say you can say, have more doctors. Yes, of course, you need medical assistance. But far more important is to ensure that the conditions in which people live are such that the need for doctors becomes less and less. That would be the more healthier approach. And I think here, rather than go through the prescriptions which a lot of my Nobel-winning Bengali economists suggested of just doling out money, the idea was that yes, of course, you must dole out some in the form of free rations, that you must dole out in the form of the Kisan Nidhi which has been given. You must dole out resources in the form of free vaccinations. But most important, you must create the conditions in which people can recover. Now, how successful are these prescriptions, how the conditions, is really going to be the test. Expansion of Manrega is not necessarily the criterion of a healthy society. Manrega is a desperate means when work is not available. It is an emergency situation which is there. What we need to do is to actually ensure that Manrega is properly implemented in its absolute right way. And there are many states in this country where Manrega, unfortunately, has been distorted, having fallen prey to what is called cut money, to patronage, to cronyism. We must ensure that the implementation of Manrega is as good as the direct benefit transfers. That is a test. These are the type of things which are important. We must ensure that the credit extension which has been given to SMEs, to MSMEs, does not suffer, as they have done in the past sometimes, in the hands of indifferent bank managers who are not very conscious of why these are there. We must be concerned that the expansion of taxes is due to expanding the tax net not burdening more people. Today, I think one of the greatest successes of this Modi government has been the adept use of technology for making people's lives much easier. Today, we've seen a 48% growth in direct taxes. Mr. Alphonse referred to that. But we've also seen that there has been a great expansion in the number of taxpayers. This is not merely only because the incomes have risen, certainly that is the case, but because tax compliance today is far better. That you've created a situation whereby it has become impossible for those who are willful tax evaders to survive. You can't buy a car without your Aadhaar card. You can't buy something without a PAN card. So these checks and balances, the use of technology has made life much more better. Today, sir, we are on the cusp of actually creating the architecture of a welfare state. But a welfare state that does not leak. It's a welfare state which is actually targeted towards the most vulnerable. Yes, there are loopholes. Who can say that there aren't loopholes? But the purpose of this is to actually ensure that those who need it most actually get it. And as for wealth creation, I think it's about time we realize that wealth creation is not a dirty word. We recognize that the state by itself cannot create everything. There was a lament yesterday in the debate about the decline of BSNL. Yes, but today ask yourself the question, have we not made a huge exponential shift in the manner in which telecom companies view their customers, where they compete with each other to lower their rates and attract customers? Would that complacency have been there if the arrogance with which the public sector initially undertook its role, had that been still there? So competition is not necessarily bad. And the important thing is to ensure that there is an actual full competitive environment which is available in this country. And I think the main task is to ensure that some form of actual monopolies do not exist in this country. That there is competition between states, there is competition between companies, there is competition to improve ourselves. And that environment is what this budget is all about. Sir, Mr. Elangovan was right. This is not an ordinary budget. Because this was not really a budget only for one fiscal year. This budget, in my view, actually set out the steps which we need to make India grow bigger and bigger, to get out of this third world mentality, to get out of a situation where we take poverty as given, where we can begin the task of actually managing prosperity, managing greatness. And this is something which may be a novel experience to those who think that the politics, the rhetoric, the poetry of India is only about deprivation, only about poverty. My friend there, Sujit Kumar, comes from Kalahandi district. Now at one time in the 80s, Mr. Jairam Ramesh would remember, Kalahandi was equated with the worst form of deprivation you could have. When you said Kalahandi, you meant deprivation. Today, what is the position of Kalahandi? Look at where it has grown. And where the potential, and it still hasn't reached its full potential. It is going. So the idea is therefore not to bask in what we are today, but what we can grow towards. And if the finance minister can simplify laws. Yes, Mr. Chidambaram was right. There are some laws which are written in a ridiculous sort of way. They are not written for ordinary users. They should be simplified. That's a fair criticism to make about the whole culture, and which he did mention was also a legacy issue. But if we say that everything, as Mr. Vishwam would like us to believe, should devolve on the state, and that we become a subject of what the government thinks, then the creative potential of India is not going to be fulfilled. And I would urge the finance minister to, in future, to look upon it at best as how people can be empowered, how we can create a facilitating environment in which this economy can grow, because we've had a few knocks. COVID has been a knock. Ukraine will probably be a knock. But we will grow out of it. And when we grow out of it, we can then realize our full potential. And that, to my mind, is the most important feature of what this budget actually tries to do. A big stepping stone towards a larger objective of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Thank you very much, sir.